Seattle, fall of 1985. The sky hung low over the city like a heavy coat no one could remove. The rain fell not in torrents, but in steady, rhythmic whispers, tapping against the windows of bookstores, coffee shops, and the windshields of cars that moved slowly through the mist. The streets glistened under streetlights, slick and shimmering like forgotten memories resurfacing after years in hiding. Claire Bennett, 28 years old, a literature teacher at a public high school, walked briskly down Pine Street, her bag heavy with books. Whitman, Dickinson, Baldwin, clutched close to her chest. Her umbrella had given up the fight hours ago, and now the drizzle had soaked through her coat and dampened the pages she tried so hard to protect. But she didn't stop. She rarely did. The air smelled of wet asphalt, distant coffee, and something older, perhaps cedar, perhaps thyme. It was a kind of weather Seattle knew intimately, a weather for reflection, for silence. Claire liked it, even when it made her lonely. Then, without a word, a coat was draped over her shoulders. She turned sharply. A man stood beside her, not young but not yet old, with eyes that held something deep and quiet, like a forest that had survived too many winters. His coat was wool, dark, warm, worn. He said only, "No one should face the rain alone," and offered the smallest of smiles before walking away, his footsteps vanishing into the mist. Claire stood frozen. She didn't know what to say. By the time she found the words, he was gone. She wore the coat home. It smelled of tobacco and pine, and something else, maybe leather, maybe memory. That night, she left it draped over the back of her reading chair, and every time she passed it, something stirred in her. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the man who had wrapped her in warmth that rainy evening carried a name she had heard only once before, whispered in a story her father never finished, and that this gesture, simple, kind, fleeting, was the beginning of an unraveling, of secrets long kept, of a promise made in a war-torn forest 4 decades earlier. If this story moved you the way it moved me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe. Your support helps us continue to share stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. It was a Thursday afternoon when Claire found herself once again climbing the familiar wooden steps to her father's porch. Her coat damp from the steady Seattle drizzle, and her breath visible in the chilled air. Carrying with her a bag of groceries, a paperback novel she thought he might like, and a restless feeling that had lingered since the stranger had wrapped her in his coat and disappeared into the fog without another word. The house, a weathered craftsman tucked into the trees on Queen Anne Hill, had always smelled faintly of pipe smoke, cedarwood, and old books, a kind of sacred hush that had settled in after her mother died 10 years prior and seemed to deepen with each passing year her father spent alone among the fading volumes and ticking clocks that never quite kept time. Walter Bennett, once a librarian and always a lover of stories, sat in his favorite leather chair by the window, a knitted blanket over his knees and a dog-eared copy of The Sun Also Rises resting face down on his lap, as though he'd been drifting between memory and text all morning, unable to separate the two completely. Claire moved through the small, dim living room with the familiarity of ritual, placing bread on the counter, setting a new carton of milk in the fridge, glancing out the window where a thin veil of rain softened the view of the street. And then, with no warning, her gaze was caught by something unexpected. A small, black and white photograph tucked inconspicuously between 2 heavy hardcovers on the bookshelf nearest the kitchen doorway, as though it had been placed there deliberately, not to be seen, but to be remembered quietly by the one who knew it was there. She pulled it out gently, brushing away a light layer of dust, and studied the image. A group of 6 or 7 soldiers, standing in front of a wooded landscape, their uniforms disheveled, their boots thick with mud, their faces marked by fatigue, but also the subtle camaraderie of men who had survived something unspoken. Her eyes moved across the row of faces until they stopped, heart-quickening, breath caught, on the man standing slightly behind the others, half in shadow, his mouth tilted in the suggestion of a smile, his eyes dark and steady and unmistakably familiar, not because she had seen the photo before, but because she had seen that face in the rain only days ago as he placed his coat on her shoulders, and vanished. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent when she asked, "Dad, who is this?" Walter turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his glasses and took the photo from her outstretched hand, holding it closer to his face for a moment before his expression shifted into something she couldn't quite define. Surprise, memory, maybe even grief. "That's Edward Miller," he said after a pause. "He saved my life." Claire sat down across from him, the room around her suddenly heavier, as though the air itself had thickened. "During the war?" she asked. Walter nodded, his fingers tightening around the photo frame. "It was 1945. We were somewhere near Bastogne. Everything had gone to hell. I'd been hit, shrapnel to the leg, and was stuck alone in a ravine, bleeding and freezing and thinking it was the end. And then he appeared, out of nowhere, like something out of a dream. He didn't say much, just wrapped me in his coat, hoisted me onto his back and carried me out through the trees." Claire listened, the story wrapping itself around her like fog, familiar and foreign at once. "We hid in a barn for 2 nights, Walter continued, his voice low and even. "He made sure I stayed conscious, told me stories, jokes, anything to keep me from drifting too far. When the medics finally came, he disappeared. I never even got the chance to thank him." Claire leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're sure it was him?" Walter looked up, puzzled. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "I think I saw him a few nights ago, downtown. It was raining. He gave me his coat." For a long moment her father said nothing. Then he looked down at the photograph, traced the man's face with one finger, and whispered, more to himself than to her, "After all this time." Claire stood up and crossed the room. She placed the photo gently back on the shelf, this time facing forward, as if inviting its history to be known. Her father watched her, eyes glistening. "I never told anyone about him," he said. "Not really. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Or maybe I didn't want to remember." Claire nodded, suddenly understanding more than she expected to. And in that quiet room, filled with rainlight and the scent of old paper and time, something shifted between them. An invisible thread pulled taut, from past to present, from father to daughter, from a stranger in the rain to the soldier who had once carried a broken man through a forest, and without knowing it, into a future neither of them could have foreseen. The following evening, Claire lay in bed, the sound of rain tapping rhythmically against her window pane, and tried to imagine the forest her father spoke of, that silent place far from Seattle yet vivid in his tone, the place where, decades before, Edward Miller had found Walter lying broken amid twisted roots, frost, and war. She closed her eyes and let herself be carried into Walter's memory. The trees towering and unspeaking, their needles and bark frozen stiff with cold, the ground blanketed in half-melted snow that gave way beneath each desperate footstep, the forest swallowing the distant rumble of artillery and the echo of collapsing structures, the world barraged by chaos, and the wind carrying something more than cold. A numbness that wrapped itself around him deeper than any wound. In that forest, Walter had lain prostrate, mind fogged, blood seeping from his thigh, the pain louder than any voice. He had believed that the forest itself would reach over and close his eyes with something like mercy. Then, through the dimmed world, Edward had appeared. Not a ghost, but a man with fear and kindness in equal measure. He knelt, tore his own coat to wrap around Walter's shoulders, whispering fragments of songs about home, about huckleberry pies, about children, anything to ease the cold's attempt to claim Walter's breath. Claire pictured that coat now, not unlike the one that had found her. She imagined how Edward pressed his sleeve to Walter's wound to stem the blood, his hands steady and warm. He carried him through the trees, each step deliberate, silent, weighted with urgency but tempered by humanity. They emerged at the edge of the forest as stars were swallowed by morning grey, and strangers, until Edward slipped away, as silently as he'd arrived, leaving Walter with nothing but his breath and the fading echo of a promise. "I told him," Walter had said, voice breaking the first time. "I told him if I survive, I'll find him. I'll tell him he saved me. He asked for my name. I gave it without thinking. I was so sure I'd see him again. But he never did." And years passed. Years when Walter returned home, married, raised a daughter whose own name he had given after deciding his marriage would not be built on another man's memory, but on its renewal. For years, he carried the memory of Edward in a private corner, journal entries that ended unfinished, photographs he avoided looking at, meditations that turned into silence. Claire thought of her own life, how she had taught her students to recognize the power of words, to finish what had been left undone, to name unspoken promises, but she had never seen this in her father's eyes until now. The promise Walter made, tethered to survival, had drifted until it settled here in Claire's hands. The unkept promise was not betrayal. It was survival's shadow, the truth that sometimes we carry our gratitude so deeply that we fear its weight. We repress its memory for fear we carry more than we deserve. Claire sat up then, the quilt at her waist, and remembered Lanford, that small park near her childhood home, where she had practiced typing letters on a vintage typewriter once her grandmother owned, and thought maybe writing them again could help. Maybe tracking Edward wasn't only to fulfill a father's promise, but to lift the silent weight his gratitude had become. She made herself sit at the desk by her bedroom window, the rain still whispering outside, a different rain from Seattle, colder and sharper in her mind's forest. But she typed, "Dear Mr. Miller, I don't know if you will remember me, but you saved my father's life in a forest near Bastogne in 1945. I'm his daughter. My name is Claire. I saw your photograph in his house, a photograph someone mailed to him. I think I saw you here in Seattle in the rain. I don't know what this letter will do, but I'm writing it because some promises deserve to be named." Her fingers paused. She reread the words. They were good enough, and she pressed print, folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and paused again. But this time, her breath didn't tremble. She knew where she would go tomorrow morning, to the post office, then the archives online, then maybe the Veterans Affairs records, hospital logs from the war, anything that might tell her Edward Miller had chosen to survive, and maybe, after so many years, might finally answer back. Because survival changes us, insists on our silence or noise. But sometimes, after 40 years, you find that voice and use it, and in doing so, give life to something bigger than grief. Claire's heart pounded as she walked through the narrow hallway of the modest house that Edward Miller had called home for most of his life. A narrow home in the outskirts of Seattle that carried an air of quiet endurance, where the front door opened to a living room illuminated by late afternoon light, drifting through lace curtains and illuminating dust motes, hanging like ancient memories in the air. She had called ahead, yes, but still, she felt as if she were stepping into an unknown country, one of quiet dignity, suppressed emotion, and decades of silence. Edward stood in the center of the room, not tall, his shoulders slightly stooped, his hair white around the ears, but his eyes steady, eyes that, in photographs and dreams, Claire had seen before but never truly met until now, and now found themselves searching her face with gentle curiosity. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice hushed but warm, as though the rain itself had been held back by the singularness of this moment. Claire managed a slight nod, looking around instead. Antique tools hung neatly on a pegboard above a workbench in the adjacent room. A typewriter sat on a desk near a stack of well-worn books. Envelopes unsent lay loosely in a drawer, edges frayed, their ink fading but still legible, letters perhaps long intended but never mailed. Claire began, but the sentence faltered, so she cleared her throat and tried again. I'm grateful you agreed to meet me. I know this must be unexpected. Edward gently gestured toward an armchair draped with a quilt. Claire sat down with the photograph in her lap, the one that had brought her here, and when their eyes met again, it was as if the years between them collapsed. She said softly, I understand you saved my father. He nodded, gaze dropping to his hands folded one over the other. I remember standing in those trees, their branches weighted with snow, the world quiet except for the sound of distant artillery, and I heard someone moan, a voice muffled by the forest floor. I found him there, hurt and alone. I didn't think. I just did what seemed human. His confession landed between them, exact and unadorned. Claire studied him, the man who had carried her father through snow and fear, and realized that what she'd expected, heroism wrapped in medals, was replaced by something infinitely more profound: humility. You never contacted Dad, she said carefully. Why? Edward turned to look at her, a crease forming between his brows that spoke of guilt or regret, maybe both. I tried, he whispered. Letters addressed, stamped, written in assembled years of thinking, but I never sent them, or at least most. And then, the years went by. I was in Seattle already soon after the war, trying to rebuild, working nights in a print shop, mornings as a mechanic, scared of words that could break me or him if they were misunderstood. Bureaucracy took over, no record of his name, no place to send them, and I thought it best to remain in silence rather than disrupt the life he built. Claire closed her eyes, thinking of the cold letter she had typed. She wondered if he would have opened it, if that gesture meant more to him than decades of unspoken gratitude. Turning the photograph in her hands, she said, My father thought you were a ghost. He lived with that gratitude like a secret burden for 40 years. That photograph came in the mail once. No return address, just EM scrawled on the back. Edward inhaled deeply, as if drawing air from that moment, then exhaled. That was me. I sent that photo years ago, handing it to one of his former comrades, hoping it would find its way to him. I thought the picture could say what I never did in words, just who I was, still remembering. A hush settled between them, not empty, but full, rich with unspoken acknowledgement. Claire finally looked up, tears glistening faintly in her eyes. You made me realize that some promises don't require words, they require presence. You were there then. You are here now. Edward's face softened, a fragile smile lifting the corners of his mouth. I never vanished because I didn't care. I vanished because I thought distance would protect both of us. Claire reached out, placing her hand gently over his. In that moment, she understood what he had given so many years ago, not just a life, but the gift of choice, survival, dignity, and peace. They spoke then, softly, about the war's burden, about memory and forgetting, about small kindnesses that outlive wars and names that echo across time. Edward showed her the typewriter where he had written letters, piles of paper next to it with beginnings and no endings. She read an unopened envelope addressed to Walter Bennett. She folded it and placed it beside the photograph. When Claire finally stood to leave, dusk had fallen fully, and Edward stood in the doorway, rain beginning again, but no longer cold. He didn't offer a coat. She didn't need one now. As she walked away through the wet street, her bag with the photograph and letter pressed to her chest, she felt Edward's silence transform beneath her fingertips into something alive. History redeemed, promises honored, and the knowledge that sometimes saving someone lives not in stories, but in the quiet forever of being there. Months passed, and with them came winter. Quiet, steady, and familiar in the way it settled over Seattle like a soft grey veil. Claire often found herself walking through Volunteer Park, where the trees stood bare and the paths glistened with rainwater, where memory followed her like a second shadow, constant and calm. It was in these walks, during the still hours between grading papers and caring for her father, that she began to understand the weight of what had happened. Not just the reunion, or the letter, or even the photograph, but the slow uncoiling of something long held tight inside her family. Edward passed away quietly in early December. There was no funeral, just a brief notice in the paper, a man with few known relatives, no dramatic endings. But in his modest home, Claire had found something he'd left behind, not for her specifically, not labeled or addressed, but clear in its intention, a collection of his letters gathered in a small wooden box, along with a page that simply read, in careful typed print, "For when the silence becomes too much." Claire didn't cry when she read the letters. She didn't need to. Instead, she felt a kind of release, like breathing air she hadn't known she'd been holding. Each page held a version of Edward that few had ever seen. Thoughtful, uncertain, deeply aware of his own absence. He had spent years living in quiet service to memory, writing what he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. Her father, Walter, read them slowly, one letter each day. Sometimes he'd pause mid-sentence and simply stare at the page, his hand trembling slightly. Then he'd close his eyes and say, "He remembered more than I did." And somehow, that gave him peace. In the spring, Claire published a small book. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it was honest. She called it The Man Who Helped in the Rain. It wasn't about war, not really. It was about silence, about memory, about gestures that echo long after they're made. The coat in the rain, the hand in the forest, the letter never sent but always felt. She included excerpts from Edward's letters, her father's reflections, and her own story. How a simple moment in a storm had opened a door she hadn't even known was closed. The book found readers. Not thousands, but enough. Enough for a mother in Vermont to write and say her father had been silent his whole life, and now she understood why. Enough for a Vietnam veteran to call it the only story that didn't make me feel alone. Enough for Claire to know that stories like hers weren't rare, only rare. Rain still came, of course. Seattle was never without it, but Claire no longer saw it as something to run from. When she walked and felt the water on her coat, she remembered Edward. Not as a soldier, not even as a savior, but as a man who believed that no one should be left alone in the storm. And now, when she saw someone standing without shelter, without direction, she stopped. Sometimes she said nothing, sometimes she offered her coat, and every time she thought, some gestures carry more than warmth. They carry history, they carry peace, they carry us back to one another. We share new stories every day, real stories that move and inspire. If this one touched your heart, please like and subscribe. And remember, some gestures stay with us forever.